Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Friends, Jim Hanink here with Mario Ramos-Reyes and our special guest, Mr. Joe Schreiner. Today, the Open Door will discuss both the use and misuse of rhetoric, especially in politics. And this is a distinctive day for those of us with the American Solidarity Party because it's the beginning of our annual convention. And I'm sure even among us, there will be not only the use of rhetoric, but the misuse of rhetoric. We will begin, as always, with a prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you'll renew the face of the earth. Lord, by the light of the Holy Spirit, you have taught the hearts of your faithful. In the same Spirit, help us to relish what is right and always rejoice in your consolation. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Let's get right into it. Joe, you've been doing more speaking and debating than usual, although you usually already do a lot of debating and speaking, but you've been doing even more. And so I especially want to ask you, but the questions I'm asking you, I would ask any public figure. How can you effectively speak? I guess that means how can you truly reach very different audiences and do so, called to do so in very different ways? How does that work? What's going through your head?
Well, as an example, Jim, between you and Mario, there is a tremendous amount of philosophical intellectualism. Am I kind of right on that?
Well, I wouldn't say tremendous amount. We scrape by, though.
Yeah, I would, based on listening to other shows and reading your posts, there's a modicum of that there. So, point being is that I can talk on that level to you guys, and I might not be as versed in some of the specific philosophical thought streams, but I know enough to get by, and that will come out in my vernacular as this discourse. And there's the word right there, continues. Concurrently, on a street corner, talking to a steel worker coming out of a plant in Cleveland, I can easily shift gears and talk in common sense, common man language. And that's just because I've had a tremendous amount of experience in a bunch of different circles across a wide spectrum over 30 years. And the Lord has just given me those different experiences in order to be able to not only relate, but to relay the messages in my platform, the messages in the ASP platform, and just as one example, I'm talking to the steel worker coming out of the mill. What do you guys think the chances I use the word distributism, he's going to understand that, right?
Won't fly. It won't fly. It won't even walk.
It won't, yeah. That's exactly it. But if you're talking about, like we stand for having a lot less big corporations and, more mom and pop shops like it used to be in the old days, that kind of thing. So that more people had ownership and that kind of deal. And, what do you think of the Browns this year? That's what...
Overrated. They're overrated, but go ahead. That's when the conversation ends. If you say they're overrated.
You're killing me. But that's good. With that, and so good insertion there. But yeah, and so in order to be effective as a politician, to use the phrase that Paul used in the Bible, you have to be all things to all people. And that doesn't mean you compromise your stances, but it means that you adjust the vernacular, the dialogue, to fit the circumstance. And again, I've got so many years of doing this that it's old hat to me, and I'm pretty comfortable in it, actually.
Okay, now Mario, you've listened to Joe says politicians. I know he meant to say statesmen. You've listened to politicians and the rare statesmen in many different contexts, including a Latin American context. Do you connect with what Joe's saying, and do you think it's the way politicians work, and do you think that way works, or do you think when they're changing keys from morning to night, the melody gets mashed?
Well, before going into a very quick answer to your question, I think that remembering Mortimer Adler's philosophy is everybody's business. It's not only our business who claim, like us, claim to know something about philosophy. I think it's everybody's business. It's the citizenry that need to somehow absorb certain principles, and they do in a different way of expressing, but they know common sense principles. I believe that the human condition allow anyone to grasp those principles. So when we convey them, perhaps we use a fancy language, and the fault is in ourselves. But generally, that is what the challenge we face every time that we teach philosophy to, let's say, freshman class, to make complex issues simple so that they can engage in a conversation. And I think also that should be, the task of anyone who is involved in politics. Having said that, my experience about rhetoric in politics has been not as much as to persuade others, which is also happening when some politicians speak or try to propose their policies. But sometimes some politicians adjust their own message to the audience. And so if the audience in the morning is a group of workers, they use a language and a proposal that may be sympathetic of that audience. And in the evening, if the audience is different, they just shift gears and give another proposal according to their audience. So they start changing the message, because ultimately it seems that the only goal that they may have is to seize power, get elected. So to me, what is more common, I'm not generalizing here, is more common is just to misuse of rhetoric. And that has to do precisely with sometimes, and very often, politicians don't really have many strong principles. So principle is something that they adjust according to the audience or according to the people who are listening to them. So that, I think, is my impression. I may be wrong on that. There has been some politicians who are very strong on their principles, and yet, because of that, sometimes they run into difficulties in getting elected or getting their message across.
Okay, so Joe, it seems to me Mario is saying, yeah, that's what you folks try to do, but in his experience, more often than not, the fellow walking the high wire either falls off or jumps off in order to get more support from the group he happens to be with it. Would you say that's true? Sad, but true?
Well, in a generalized way, I would think that that's apt. It's funny. I just had to answer this question on the stream. I didn't have to, but Jeffrey Stewart said, what is it that you have to work on to be more effective as an ASP candidate? And the assessment, and to speak to what Mario was saying, is a lot of times with Democrats and Republicans in the quote-unquote duopoly, they set up, say, an event at a diner. Well, guess who is going to be in the diner? A bunch of Republicans, if it's a Republican candidate, and a bunch of Democrats, if it's a Democratic candidate. That's a real orchestrated kind of thing. They set up in advance for the most part, and so they have
to tell them where the diner is because they never dine at the diner except on this occasion.
That's exactly, and there's a good point. But and so the candidate gets a bunch of softball questions that are all in line with Democratic thought or Republican thought or whatever. Now, with me, there's two things that happen. My platform, I've been around 12 years longer than the ASP was in existence in the United States of America. And so,
well, now listen, Joe, you wouldn't have to be more than 24 to say something like that.
Yeah. Anyway, point being is that my platform and the ASP platform is as countercultural as the day is long. In almost every area, and that's because the predominant paradigms. And there's my philosophical vernacular to speak to you guys.
Thomas Kuhn, move over. Go ahead.
Pelican predominant paradigms, like that. So anyway, point being is that I'm stumping in a diner down in Alabama, and because I don't have this big party machine, who's going to be in the diner in Alabama? Bunch of truck drivers, that kind of thing, and one of them is going to find out because I'm passing out campaign literature and I'm talking to them, and one of them says, "So, what's your stance on immigration?" Now, my stance on immigration is the same as the ASP, which is that we need to provide asylum and social justice to these people, and maybe family reunification, and send people down to the other countries in order to help them to become as sustainable as possible in their countries besides helping them here. How do you think that is going to play with those truck drivers in Alabama?
They're going to squeeze you to death.
Yeah, right. Especially, and I'm not that big. I work out, but I'm not that big. But the point being, and this is addressing what Mario is, sometimes with politicians, not only is it a thing about sort of this milquetoast, wishy-washy kind of thing? They're afraid. They're afraid to be strong, and that's an interpersonal thing, and they're afraid to be countercultural or to stand up for a principle in a venue that isn't friendly to them, so to speak. And so what God's done with me is and I do it some days better than others, is he's put me in a whole lot of those kind of venues over an extended period of time in order to, it's like refiner's fire, in order for me to be as strong as possible standing up for the principles in any setting. And so ultimately, I think what you do, Mario, is you run into politicians that, number one, interpersonally are not that strong, and two, some of them want to get elected, so they'll become a chameleon and say whatever they think the populace or the audience wants to hear, and that's problematic, obviously. But because my faith drives my principles, I just look at it in another form of standing up for God, and so that's my answer to that one.
Let me ask you this, Joe. Do you ever wake up at, say, 3 o'clock in the morning, and as you come to semi-consciousness, hear yourself saying to yourself, why did I say that? Or hear yourself saying to yourself, I should have told him that. Do you ever second guess yourself, like in the middle of the night?
I have a wife, Jim.
She tells you to shut up in the middle of the night.
Yeah, I cannot tell you how many times, Jim, she has looked at me and said, I cannot believe you said that. I can give you two. That has put her in my life for a distinct reason. I can give you two real quick ones. One of them, you actually kind of enjoy this as professors, is I was asked by a professor of history at the University of Toledo to come give a talk to his history class, one of his history classes. So I'm giving the talk, and in the middle of it, somebody asked me about, well, you might not win, and so why are you doing this? And I said, well, one part is that every time I've researched all these models across the country, and so every time that I plant a seed about a particular model in the press or in a talk or something, and somebody picks up on it, they do it, and then it ripples out, somebody else does it, does it. There you go. Does it. It's as if I get a policy enacted long before I ever get to D.C. And so, in essence, at least partially, I am President of the United States now. And Jim?
Yep.
They all smiled like really politely. And when we were walking to the motorhome after the talk, my wife looked up at me and broke the silence by saying, Joe, it's a happy little world you're living in, isn't it?
Well, I won't ask what you said to her then.
Oh, nothing. I was like, she got to send me here or send her here to keep me balanced. And the other story is a quick one. Was we were down in Florida, and they had an editorial board at a newspaper who had come up with a series of questions to ask me. And so I'm sitting at a conference table in a relatively big newspaper. I'm trying to remember that I want to say it's Port Charlotte. Yeah, Port Charlotte, Florida. And so I'm sitting at the table with two editors and a reporter. And the reporter was charged with asking me the questions, but the editors would chime in, that kind of thing. And in order to test, I don't know if you guys remember, but back during campaign 2000, they had asked Bush, the leaders of 5 different countries. A couple of them were relatively obscure, and he only got like 1 out of 5 right. Do you guys remember that by any chance?
Sort of, yes.
Well, what happened was this was like 2 weeks after that had happened. And so they decided they were going to ask the average Joe, quote unquote, who the leader of China was. And I got to tell you, at the time, I didn't know who the leader of China was. And so I looked at the reporter and I said, I know I'm going to get this 100% correct. The leader of China is a Chinese guy. She looked up. She had her head down, right notes. She looked up and she goes, is that your final answer, Mr. Schreiner? So I get in the motorhome after the interview, and my wife said, how did it go? And I said, well, I struggled a little bit on a foreign relations question. She said, what question was that? And I explained the whole thing to her. And she looked at me, and she said, I'm getting out of the van. So I don't have to worry about waking up at 3 in the morning, Jim, with self-analysis. God put this woman right there to tell me, you idiot. So,
very good, very good. Yeah. Now, I want to get back to Mario for a minute or more. We're in no rush, that's for sure. Mario was talking about, to compare your meeting a group of people, say, going to work. Mario was talking about sitting down the first week of class with a group of freshmen. Now, Mario, do you think, you can ask me that same question, feel free, do you think that group of freshmen that you meet every year at the beginning of the year, do you think they should be voting? Do you think they know enough to vote?
I think they do. They do. Of course. I think, well, that may lead us into discussion what is a democratic system and what are the foundation for a democratic regime. They have common sense. They have in their heart the sense of justice, the sense of fairness. They may not know and articulate well those principles, but they have these foundational principles in them. And so perhaps the task of a teacher is just to realize what they already have and awaken them and be conscious of this responsibility. Perhaps it's not as perfected these ideas in them, but the same thing we can say in an individual who is 60 years old. He may not be aware of certain things, but doesn't mean he doesn't have this desire in their heart. But let me go to something regarding this, and my question, a previous question, which I say, well, what I have witnessed on politicians is that they have, and I think in some ways is expected, they want to win, they want to get elected because they may have desires in their heart, perhaps motivated by their own ideology to get elected and make things better and transform. And so they go to an audience and they tell the audience what the audience want to hear, and another audience does the same. So he is a little bit of semi-Machiavellian, if you will, because the end justify the means of that fellow. That may be, in general, what you see around, and that's why some people are disappointed. And they say, well, what they do is just get elected. They forget about their promises. Now, but let's, for the sake of the discussion, move to a completely opposite spectrum. Someone who is there is a politician, and he is full of conviction, and he's a very honest person, and he tells always the truth to an audience. So what are the chances that you think of that politician to get elected? Always tell the truth to any audience.
Joe, what do you think? You always tell the truth? You're going to get elected?
About 9-10 years ago, there was an op-ed piece in Time magazine. And what the guy wrote was this. He said, at some point, America just might be ready for a politician who doesn't blow more sunshine up, I'm paraphrasing here, people's derrieres, but rather a politician who tells the truth. And so I think it is feasible to get elected that way, but the confluence would have to be that simultaneously the nation that the politician, or the populace just in general, that the politician is talking to has hit a collective bottom. The analogy would be an alcoholic. They are not extremely teachable until they have hit a bottom in their life. And then they are open to the truth. So I happen to think, and I'm talking more individually at this point about me and the ASP platform and the state of the country right now, that we are coming to the apex of hitting the bottom as a country. And at that point, the ASP platform might well seem desirable to people, as much as it doesn't right at this moment. So that's my answer. It's situational. I think sometimes a politician comes forward, Mario, and they tell the truth, and they might be right, and they might get 3 votes as a result of it. And so again, it kind of depends on the circumstances and God's grace. But that would be my answer to that.
All right. Now, let me ask a question that takes us just a bit forward. You want to tell the truth. I think you do tell the truth. Telling the truth for a long time. Is there a way that you can find forums? Now, if everyone listening to this show were Latin fluid and fluent, I would say find fora, but they might think I was talking about fauna or something like that. Can you find forums where truth-telling is encouraged, or are you always walking into the wind?
Well, I mean, that I'm kind of, as far as the finding forums on the front end of that, Jim, Dorothy Day used to talk about, she would talk or go where she was invited. And so she trusted that God was inviting her to these places, and she would show up. And there were obviously all different kinds of forums and with different levels of receptivity. So, that kind of is situational as well. As far as, and this is a good example, like during the debate with Brian at that Midwest Regional Conference, the topic about global warming came up. And my stance is that we should look at global warming like we looked at World War II from the standpoint of the American public needs to sacrifice. We need to go to rationing in the short term, and we need to ramp up alternatives in the long term. Now, that's not going to play real well in Peoria if you're asking, if you're going to say to the people as a politician, I think we should, in the short term, in order for people to do the right thing, go to rationing.
Well, you could have said that at the National Convention of Air Conditioning Installers.
Well, and I'm in those situations where I have to say that, where it's not friendly, and I'm able to do that for the most part. But and again, here's another forum. Like I was invited to sit in on a transition town meeting in Cleveland, and these are people that have formed a support group to get off fossil fuels. Yeah. So if I say it there, people are like, "Oh, that's a good idea." And so, the forum again so finding them. I don't want to be in a position where I'm just speaking to the choir with this. I actually really do want to continue to go out into these other venues in order to convey the message as well, because it's in those other venues that people need to hear the message. People in transition town, not so much, because they're already pretty motivated to do something to change in that particular area. So and I don't want to sound Pollyannish, and sometimes in those forums, I get timid. I have to ask for help internally and have God strengthen me to stand up for that stuff. Just like a couple times I've almost come to blows with some of those truck drivers, quote unquote, about some of this stuff.
Then you show them the black belt.
Well, unlike Tai Chi, I just have a yellow belt in karate. And, so I'm not as formidable.
Well, Mario, do you think that Joe's policy of saying, well, if I got an invitation, I'll go, and I keep getting these invitations, so I keep going, is that a good policy, or should he be more selective? Should he look for a place where he can communicate in the language that he feels best about communicating in? Like maybe tonight's convention night for the actually convention weekend, but debate tonight, 9 o'clock. I guess that's Eastern Standard Time. I don't give that much attention, though, because I'm in Pacific Time, which is the real time. But at any rate, should he take this course of I talk when I'm asked to talk, or should he be more selective?
Well, it's an excellent question. I think I'm with him in this. And the reason is that something that I learned many years ago, and when I read for the first time when I was very young, I read about politics, the nature of politics, a philosophical work, but very practical and very down to earth by Jacques Maritain. He said something along this line: I'm going to speak everywhere, and in everywhere that I speak, I want to remain free. Why? Because there is a heart which is listening to me, even though we may not share the same ideology, but the heart will resonate if what I'm saying is related to the human experience. And in politics, we talk about something which is giving us the sense of what we need, what are our desires regarding the common good. And so I'm going there, regardless the ideology of that group, and share what motivate me. And so in doing all that with something that's the virtue of any politician or politic itself, is prudence. And I'm going to cite something that even Maritain said. What would be my attitude, he said? Well, my attitude would say, not the person who go and ponder in every audience, but I'm not going to be the one who go and try to impose certain principles without noticing the circumstances. In other words, he's not saying I'm going to bend my principles. Say, I'm going to see how to explain them to this audience. And how then I learned that by having experience, talking many times. And he cited a verse from sacred scripture, and he said, well, our task as a politician sometimes must be what the Lord says, which is, I send you out as sheep in the middle of wolves, and so be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. And sometimes say, well, if you are wise as serpent, yes, you have to be careful, but then at the same time, you're telling what is motivating you. But if you are going to speak only to those who share your own views, then you are somehow try to control reality, and you're not going to persuade anyone. You are going to persuade those who already are with you. And so you are not going to expand your proposal. So after this long explanation, I think I agree with Joe on this.
Can I add an addendum to this?
Sure.
And Mario just talked about controlling reality. And this has to do with, like, God's put me, as far as the campaigning and all that, in the middle of pop culture America. He hasn't changed it yet. And so I've had to learn to deal with the vicissitudes, another philosophy word there, of the whole thing. Now, we were approached about 7 years ago by two accomplished writers in Los Angeles who had heard about the campaign, had gone to our website, saw some of the film clips and the other stuff, and they said, Joe, we would like to do a reality show on your campaign. And the reason why the reality shows are working is because it's a more unvarnished reality. People are kind of drawn to people making mistakes or having gaffes, or it's like real life. I mean, you guys know, like, you go to teach in a classroom, tell me it goes 100% okay. Tell me there isn't a kid sometimes who says, well, gee, professor, in this particular case, do you think you're right in that, and you think, no, the kid's right. And so there's or you make a mistake and you call Aristotle, Freud, whatever that is. And so when they were drawn to us, the reason they were drawn to us is because I was being real out on the street. It was more like the politician unplugged. And we got in it. They sold it to a big corporation out in L.A., Jim, called Relatively Real. and it came within a couple weeks of starting to be made. And last minute, there's this clause about equal access with politicians, where if one show invited one on, then they'd have to open the door for another politician. And the lawyers got together, and last minute it didn't work out.
Disappointing.
Oh, I cannot tell you, Jim, how disappointing that was to us, because we thought, here's our big break. This is going to make it a national story. And so, and, you know, they would have been seen just like my wife saying, you know, it's a happy little world you're living in, isn't it? You know, I mean, and it would have been really captivating, and it would have been real. You know, it really would have. I mean, as much as we could have made it real. But point being, though, is that in this particular culture right now, people have this innate desire to be entertained by reality. And those superheroes notwithstanding. And so, you know, it would be just, we think it just has to reach a tipping point, but we think that the campaign itself is real close to that at this point. And God apparently didn't think it was the right timing for the other thing, although I argued with him a lot.
He took notes, didn't he?
No, he was like, oh, Joe's upset. So,
well,
yeah, that's just an addendum to that, but, you know.
So often now, it seems to me that what the media like to present is the casting of artificial pearls before real swine. And the discourse is really, really, really muddy.
Right.
Now, I just want to say two things by examples about how things get muddied. And we started out talking about rhetoric, and we'll be talking about it one way or another as we go along. But I've seen a couple times now, probably more, even in American Solidarity Party exchanges, this sort of expression: we should change our rhetoric, or the rhetoric that she used was, or his rhetoric puts me off. And it's almost like the term rhetoric is used like a air freshener or something like that, a perfume, a verbal paint job, and literally, like there's this store where you can go buy cans of rhetoric, and make sure when you go to the store you have your sample here, what kind of color of rhetoric you're looking for, and then you come back and you use that color. And the irony is that if we talk about we should change our rhetoric, then what we have as our understanding of rhetoric is just the wrong understanding. If somebody wants to say something like change your approach, all right. But if the whole of rhetoric is reduced to a tool, an instrumental tool, then I think we're in a bad way. And here's another example. I've seen this before, and I think it has to do, actually, with software programming. Or people who deal with software programming. Someone will say, well, this part was all right, but the verbiage before that part needs to be changed. The verbiage. Well, if what we're saying is just verbiage, we ought to shut up.
It sounds like my wife.
The idea of verbiage, when I see that term used and it's referring to an explanation or a statement of a position, and somebody says change the verbiage, you want to say, well, I hope it wasn't verbiage, and I hope we don't change it to some other sort of verbiage. Well. Now, in that we have mentioned, thanks Mario, Jacques Maritain, and we always mention the American Solidarity Party. It might be time to mention St. Thomas Aquinas. And there's a saying that he uses in many different contexts. You're surprised. He's saying it here, and it makes sense here too. He says, whatever is received according to the capacity of the receiver. Whatever is received according to the capacity of the receiver. Now, this is something he uses across the board. What does God reveal to us? Well, he doesn't reveal to us something that's beyond our capacity to understand or to accept or to more than accept, to engage our lives with. But in the context of speaking to other people in a public forum, whether it's in front of the shop or it's at the fundraiser in the evening, whatever is received according to the mode, the capacity of the receiver. Could we say that's a good rule for the use of rhetoric, for honest rhetoric? You want to connect what you have to say with the person you're speaking with. And you know the person you're speaking with could understand this, but not that, would appreciate that, but not this. Is Aquinas' dictum, whatever is received according to the capacity of the receiver. Is that a good starting point for somebody trying to understand rhetoric in political life?
You're talking to Joe?
I'm talking to the choir here.
I didn't know if you were talking to Mario or me.
No, you know how the choir is. They need talking to at least as much as the preacher needs talking to.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll respond to that to a degree, I'll actually go back to a point you were making just before that. Is that you were talking about a verbal paint job, and well, I think what happens, and I can talk from my own personal experience again, is that I went out and interviewed a whole lot of people about a whole lot of different subjects. Many of them people as knowledgeable as you guys are about certain things, And,
plus, their bills were all paid.
There you go. So, and as an example, there's a guy. Bluffton University has a economics professor who I sat in on a talk he gave, and he was talking about, he goes, a lot of times with these trade deal things, we're always looking at it through the myopic lens of America strong, which is what is most advantageous for America. And he said, meanwhile, so you have these big corporations and you get farmers that are being subsidized, growing these huge crops, and then are able to undersell the subsistence farmer down in Guatemala, selling to the market up the street. And so here is, through globalization, he was talking in pretty complex terms about how, through subsidy programs, et cetera, that is an option that we take without looking at the morality of it, And so I can talk about that in that terminology to certain circles. But in other circles, you have to, not so much verbiage as you have to just jack down the syllables, so to speak, and put it in some kind of anecdotal story that people can get. Kind of like Jesus told parables sometimes, because otherwise it wasn't going to make sense. And I think that's the same for this. But I think what's happened in our society is that it's just like with the painting, and only because That's another thing. It's like I got this background. I got a degree in journalism, and I switched professions, and I was a counselor, had a private practice, was doing real well before I started doing this. And now, to make ends meet when I get back, because I can't do either of those professions except for a little freelance writing, I do house paintings. So I am constantly, Jim, in front of the color charts. And right now, way too many color choices. There just is. And so, but I think that is a metaphor for this complex society where we've come up with so much superfluous, and there's the word, verbiage, that we don't say what we mean anymore. We're able to couch it, all this other stuff, and so what it does is it tones it down, it waters it down, whatever. And I think a lot of people they're comfortable in doing that in order not to deal with the conflict that might come if you just say directly, Harry, this is wrong. And so I think that's just endemic of our society right now and how we've gotten this verbiage, rhetoric, et cetera, as opposed to just saying what you mean. I just want the color blue, okay? Not azure blue, not transcendent blue. I just would like blue, but what's happened to us is we've been able to use that to rationalize a lot of stuff in the context of the verbiage. And even that last sentence might be a little bit over the top. So anyway, that's my take. And when you said verbal paint job, I thought,
yeah,
I got
it. I guess the language that captures the point of this focus is jive. All kinds of people say that's just a bunch of jive, right? So you could have political jive too. And by way of contrast, last 2 weeks back, we did an open door on Cardinal Newman, and Newman's motto as a bishop, naturally in Latin, cor ad cor loquitur, heart speaks to heart. Heart speaks to heart.
That's good.
And if we could find ways in our discussions to make space for heart speaking to heart, then we would have accomplished a lot.
Yeah, that's good.
I have
yes.
Jim.
Yes.
Regarding your question about the pastoral principle of Aquinas, whatever is received according to the mother receiver. I have an experience last Saturday about that, and it's a very short, brief story. But I was contacted by what is called a think tank from my home country, Paraguay, because they were training business people and politicians, and they do all the time. And they called me because they wanted to interview me on ethics and politics. Generally, the seminar was on policy and corruption and all these issues. So and they contacted me and say, well, we want to interview you about ethics and politics. And so the person who contacted me explained a little bit about the dynamic, and we were about to be talking through phone, and there was another professor here in the state to be also interviewed. And I said to this fellow, I said, well, do you realize that I'm teaching philosophy? And he said, yes, I do, because my focus on the issue will have some philosophical principles and so on. He said, yeah, we know. And so then we have the exchange on Saturday through phone, and there were a few 200 people there, and we were discussing. And so, but the person who was directing the exchange or the question really did not know exactly what to ask. about ethics and politics, and they moved from one concept to another, corruption, and whether corruption was immoral, etc. So what I thought was they lacked the understanding of the basics, meaning of the term, definition of what is ethics, what is morality, what is moral philosophy, what is politics, etc. And so the discussion went to different topics about policy and so on. And so I felt completely in 2 hours that we really did not speak about the subject and the relationship between practical sciences, ethics, and politics. So the conversation ended. We say goodbye, and then I was just very frustrated because I said, well, that was not the goal of the talk according to what was informed. And I struggled with that for 2 days and say, well, I need to write a letter to these people and said, well, you need to learn about this, blah, blah, blah. And I tried to somehow explain to them what they should have said to me or asked to me so that they can learn. And then I started thinking about that, precisely that principle of Aquinas, and said, well, perhaps by sending a letter, making clear about what should be the topic, how defined in the question, I would be trying to control their own freedom, their own awareness of the issue. And I said, well, if I said certain things there, probably those who have the capacity to receive, they may have received already. And so I said, that gave me a sense of peace. I said, well, I did my best. Whoever is going to receive is going to receive. Whoever is not going to receive, not even if I have been given more fair question about the issues. So it seems that my point here is that sometimes we try to be so have a program by which we have exactly the things to say to people because the only way that they can receive that. And we don't count in their own development, their own maturity or awareness or lack thereof. And I think that is, very prudent principle, and we can apply prudently to different situations.
I guess one way of thinking about that is you can overteach.
Yes.
You can overteach.
Yes.
Boy, there are scriptural places that come to mind. Having ears they hear not, having eyes they see not, and then Lazarus and Dives, the rich man, wants to have Lazarus go tell his relatives what's going to happen if they keep doing what they're doing. And the good Lord says to Dives, they have Moses and the prophets. If they don't pay attention to them, they're not going to even pay attention to Dives if he comes back, just as to Lazarus if he comes back from the dead. So exactly. There's a certain point where you just, well, I've had my say. I've said what I can, the best I can. But we're going to keep working on this. And my last question, and we don't have to, give any concise answer to this, and it doesn't make any difference if we go a little over because this is a podcast, right? This is a podcast. A couple of different times in Facebook exchanges that have involved our worthy guest, Joe Schreiner. Joe has said, "Oh, for the days of the Lincoln versus Douglas debates." Now, I'm sure a lot of our freshman students, Mario, although they probably have heard of Lincoln, have never heard of Stephen Douglas. And given that they're used to our students, freshmen or otherwise, given that they're used to a 50-minute hour, same with psychiatrists, given 50-minute hours is the absolute maximum. They'd be poor candidates to participate in Lincoln versus Douglas debates. Now, Joe, how come there can't be Lincoln versus Douglas debates? That is the style today. How come college debaters, have various forms of debate, and one of the forms is Lincoln versus Douglas form? How come we can't do that? How come we have to have sound bites that are prepared precisely as sound bites on television? And how come when we have the debates among 20 people, we have to have all kinds of music? Check out your playlist. Check out what should we have on our playlist to keep people even there to hear what they have to say. What's the problem with us?
Well, there was, and he came after Lincoln and Douglas, but there was a pop culturalist who was a professor, Marshall McLuhan. And
yes,
he
something about mediums and messages, right?
That's right. Medium is the message. And so when you look at the medium today, the predominant medium, what's happening is that you watch a movie, for instance, the scene shifts every maybe 20 seconds. Mm-hmm. And so your mind gets conditioned to these quick soundbite scenes, quick soundbite phrases, etc., etc. And so the consumption of that kind of media over an extended period of time conditions the mind to be more ADD, I guess is the best way to put it. And so as a result, people resonate to that kind of discourse. And for them to sit in a room for a long period of time to hear. And you know what? I'll tell you, and that's what I like about your show, actually, Jim, is this has been, and has been before, somewhat akin to a Lincoln and Douglas orientation. From the standpoint of being able to convey a thought without worrying about, and being able to expound on it a bit. And people who have the wherewithal will listen to it. To talk to Mario's point about that conference that he was involved with, I learned early on, I would be interviewed by a television station. They'd come out and do a bunch of filming and ask me all these questions, and I would try and answer them as incisively as possible and draw in all the research that I'd done. And then the show would, and you guys know that, so you turn on the network news, regional network news, the piece would be a minute long, if I was lucky, maybe a minute and a half, and it included just snippets of stuff that I had said. And it was the same with the newspaper interviews. For the most part, like Jim, you read that one on that Arc Digital where it was a long, involved, very good
That
story.
Was a great piece. You hardly see pieces like that anymore.
Well, that was a Lincoln Douglas debate piece, so to speak, from the standpoint that, but for the most part, it would be just like the regional network television shows. The newspaper articles would be these short sound bites that they pull from all the stuff that I would say. And I would get, just as Mario was, I would get like really despondent and say to my wife, oh, I said this and I said this, and they just narrowed it down to this, and it's just like it's superficial. And she would look at me and say, did they spell your name right? She goes, it got out to like 40,000 people there, Joe. It's fine. People understood that. And so God put her there, too. To kind of, after a while, I started thinking, yeah, she got a point. People could probably only receive that much about that particular topic anyhow. And so all of a sudden, I had to, it's just like with the painting. It's like when God orchestrated me being the house painter after all the other heady stuff I was doing. There was a reporter down in Georgia, and he said, what do you do for a living? I said, I do a little house painting. And it was 2 days after the Joe the Plumber thing happened. Guess what the headline was, guys, the next day? Joe the Painter runs for president. And I thought, well, that's quirky enough. And I mean, so I've had to learn to tone down my expectations about how I'm being perceived. And it's okay. It's like it's I'm trying to do this thing for God, and so it's His show, it's not mine. And so I've had to tone down my expectations around receptivity and how I'm viewed, and that's okay. I mean, if at the end of the day, if it gets the message out and people get impacted by it, and hopefully it furthers the platform, that's what this is all about.
Very good.
Excellent.
Mario, last thoughts?
No, I completely agree. I think the whole story that you're telling is very, very illustrative of the need that we have not to be anxious about what we say sometimes and expecting everyone react the same way. Just let things go and trust the common sense and trust God in our own message.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, now, just to stir the pot, this will be my last thought, and then we'll correct this last thought with a prayer. But we're familiar with the expression, "It's better to light a candle than to curse the darkness."
Right.
Now, let's suppose I steal from St. Thomas. He always begins with a number of statements that make sense, and they usually take the form of objections to positions that he's going to argue for. But he always begins with the objections. And that was part of the requirement those days. They didn't have Lincoln-Douglas debates, but they had what we might call Friday afternoon disputations. And the question for the week would be up on the board on Monday, and then people would talk about it and meet with their tutors, and then Friday afternoon you had the disputatio, the disputation. And if you're going to take a position, well, you've been listening to what your opponents have to say all week long. So if you're going to take a position, you got to say, now our question is, as everybody knows, and then you start with objections to your own position. And you kind of look around, and if nobody says, yeah, well, what about this? But then you can go ahead and start. And Thomas would always go ahead and start by saying, sed contra. But on the other hand, respondio, I respond. But on the other hand, I respond. So that's just a context that I'm going to steal from. We're all familiar with the positive admonition. It's better to light a candle than to curse the darkness. Sed contra. On the other hand, respondio, I respond. How's about this? Why not both? Light the candle and curse the darkness. Sock them in the chops, but make sure the light's on so everybody can see it. All right. Well, that would be the mixed media presentation. Now, on a far more worthy note, we'll end with the gospel from today's liturgy, which is taken from the Gospel of Luke. The scribes and Pharisees said to Jesus, "The disciples of John the Baptist fast often and offer prayers, and the disciples of the Pharisees do the same. But yours eat and drink." Jesus answered them, "Can you make the wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? But the days will come, and when the bridegroom is taken away from them, then they will fast in those days." And he also told them a parable. "No one tears a piece from a new cloak to patch an old one, otherwise he will tear the new, and the piece from it will not match the old cloak. Likewise, no one pours new wine into old wineskins, otherwise the new wines will burst the skins, and it will be spilled, and the skins will be ruined. Rather, new wine must be poured into fresh wineskins, and no one who has been drinking old wine desires new, for he says, the old is good." Gospel of the Lord. Thank you so much. We'll be back next week.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.